I am lucky enough to be here with the guys from Fantasy Stock Exchange. They just dropped their draft guides on the site, rookie rankings on the site. And yeah, I mean, we're gearing up for the NFL Combine, one of the top 24 rookie rankings. And let's just kick it off with Genty.
Yeah, we can keep it quick on Genty. Genty's a stud. Genty knows he's a stud. We just got word today that he's probably not going to do anything at the Combine, but it's not going to matter. I listened to Daniel Jeremiah's conference call, all 2 hours and 46 minutes of it yesterday. And it seems like the NFL is having a renaissance on running backs based on what happened with Jacobs and Saquon and Derrick Henry and all these guys. I wouldn't be shocked if the Raiders pull the trigger as high as 6th overall and Genty goes that high in the NFL draft. Regardless, you're getting a 3-down stud who can catch the ball, who has an elite profile. If he does do anything testing-wise and goes in the top 10, he will end up joining Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, and Saquon Barkley in the FSC prospect model as generational prospects. If he doesn't test, he'll probably stay in the workhorse tier, but you're with Zeke, Fournette, all those type of guys there.
Yeah, and as we're recording this, as of Monday, February 24th, we actually just put out our first-round mock on the channel, and that's exactly where we had him. Number 6 overall, Las Vegas Raiders. Obviously, they hire Pete Carroll. They hire Chip Kelly. Obviously, the success of the Ohio State running game. There's so many fits in the top 10. I mean, we're even looking at, for example, Chicago with Ben Johnson coming over. We know how, from an EPA standpoint, DeAndre Swift struggled as a rusher this past year. There's so many spots in the top 10 I can see Ashton Genty going, to the point where if anybody starts mocking him at like 20th overall, 21st overall, I just have a hard time seeing him pass out of the top 15.
Okay, so I ranked the 101 alongside Jahmyr Gibbs and Bijan Robinson in my running back rankings at this point, because obviously Genty is there. And looking at where you have him in the prospect model, and one other thing I want to point out is, while he wasn't crazy with the receiving volume this past year, you go back 2 years ago, he's at the top of college football in receiving yards for running backs. Like, is it crazy to already have Genty up with Bijan and Gibbs from a dynasty perspective?
He's going to be the one the moment he's drafted, in my opinion. Like, that's as high as I am on Bijan Robinson, as high as I am on Jahmyr Gibbs. I think you're getting that caliber of running back, except you're obviously refreshing with the 2025 class. Ashton Genty is a stud. I mean, people might point, oh, well, he struggled in the Penn State game. He broke 16 tackles in that game. Like, to understand what he was doing in spite of his offensive line in that game just is a testament to how good Ashton Genty is. Multiple times this year, breaking 2, 3, 4 tackles on a certain run, bouncing that for a 75-yard touchdown. Like, he is the opportunity to be one of the top 5, top 3 overall running backs in the league, and you're getting that at 21 years old. So I don't think it's even over-exaggerating to say he would be the RB1 the moment he's drafted, and a guy that's worth a top 15 or 16 overall startup pick.
Awesome.
Yeah, I don't disagree with any of that.
Let's move to Ted McMillan. I freaking love this dude. Obviously, he's the wide receiver 1 for everybody. But I mean, I don't think people are really giving him the respect that he deserves today in overall startup value. Just looking at your prospect model on the site, if he is the top 10 NFL draft pick, the only guys that graded out higher since year 2016, Harrison, Neighbors, Chase, Lamb, London. Like, we've already talked about the dominance in terms of market share numbers, but how are you looking at him in the landscape of these other like cornerstone assets such as Drake London right now or Garrett Wilson?
Yeah, you got to remember too that Ted McMillan's grade is bound to go up on the prospect model, because he has not tested yet as of the NFL Combine. He's going to, once he gets his RAS score, his relative athletic score input, he has a chance to jump into the league winner tier where only Harrison, Neighbors, Lamb, and Chase have been. And because he's already huge, there's a good chance that if he tests 50th percentile across the board, he's going to meet the 7.5 relative athletic score marker that you kind of need to be considered like a good athlete. So, and that will obviously, if he does test well, he'll lock him into probably top 10 draft capital. And, you know, the Patriots, the Jets, the Panthers, one of those teams will probably take him in the top 10. He's very much like Drake London, the prospect, only I think he's actually more athletic. A lot of people separated, had issues with Drake London's separation ability. I do think he also has better yards after the catch ability than Drake London does. So he's a very good prospect. And at first, I wasn't really sold on him being like, okay, 101's Genty, and then there's a tier break. I actually do think it's like 101's Genty, 102's McMillan, and then there's a tier break.
Yeah, more so. I still think there's a little bit of a half tier I'd put between Genty and McMillan. As much as I love McMillan, he's probably going to be more so in that wide receiver 10 in Dynasty type of range. I would expect at the moment he's drafted. I mean, I think you can make an argument between him and like Drake London, but for me personally, that's about the range I would see. Obviously, the top 8 wide receivers, as good as McMillan is, he's not going to be touching Amon-Ra, Nico, Puka, Neighbors, BTJ, Jefferson, Lamb, Chase from the moment he's drafted. But in terms of being like a top 25-ish startup pick, top 28-ish startup pick, I think the absolute minimum he should be hearing his name off the board in startups would be about the early to mid third rounder area.
Awesome. Well, I think once you get past the top 2, this is where you can actually have some arguments back and forth. Do you want to lead us off with our third guy?
So the third guy, I think it's just a massive tier of players, first of all. It's the quarterbacks. If they get good draft capital and you play in a super flex league, you could convince me on, specifically Cam Ward, because he has, mobility, arm talent, things of that nature. Sanders, I'm a little bit lower on. We'll talk about him in a second. There is a major cluster of running backs here between Omarion Hampton, Quinshon Judkins, Travion Henderson, Caleb Johnson. Whoever gets the draft capital, the landing spot, like we get one of these guys 22nd overall to the Chargers or something like that, there's a very good chance they're going to end up being the 103. And I, for one, really believe in Emeka Egbuka. I think he has a very solid floor. I think he is a prototypical, translatable running wide receiver talent that we see all the time that gets overthought. Oh, he doesn't really have that high of a ceiling. People said that about Jefferson. People said that about Olave. People said that about Garrett Wilson. Like, you come into the league, you already know how to run routes at a very high level. That's what you're looking at. But as of now, we have Omarion Hampton as our top kind of 103 overall player.
Yeah, and just adding to Omarion Hampton, the reason why he ends up being at the top here, he is my 3rd overall player. He's Corey's 6th, but like Corey said, it's kind of a tie tier at the top. Like, we'll get into Cam Ward in a bit, Emeka Egbuka. Obviously, Omarion is actually your RB3. You have one other running back that you would mention ahead of him. But for me personally, the reason why Omarion Hampton is my number 2 running back, is my number 3 overall player, is he is your prototype NFL workhorse. He's got the size, 220 pounds. He's got the speed. He's going to run somewhere in the mid 4.4s. He's got the physicality between the tackles. He's got a 3-down skill set. And it's hard for me to not envision the NFL valuing him as a top 35 overall pick in this upcoming draft.
Awesome. Well, with our next guy, Ward, I really want to know, how tied are you to having Ward this high ahead of Sanders? Like, if Sanders actually goes ahead of Ward in the NFL draft, would you be willing to flip that at all or bring them closer together?
So from a talent evaluation standpoint, again, we're guys on YouTube. We don't have access to these dudes. Yeah. I don't know how Cam Ward's constructed above the shoulders or any of this stuff.
A lot more.
But I'm not going to say, I'm going to throw my hands up in the air and not try and evaluate these guys. When it comes to what matters for fantasy, it's pretty clear that Ward is the better option, because Ward is more mobile, has a better arm, creates big plays. Yeah, he takes more negative plays than Shedeur Sanders does, but from a sack percentage, it's actually not that different. And Cam Ward, let's say he goes 6th overall to the Raiders and Sanders went 3rd to the Giants. I am going to take Cam Ward comfortably ahead of Shedeur Sanders, even if he gets lower NFL draft capital, because he has the stuff that translates, that matters for fantasy football production. Whereas Shedeur Sanders is the type of quarterback he is. It's going to look like Jared Goff if it goes well. It's going to look like Tua Tagovailoa if it goes well. Whereas Cam Ward could maybe ascend into it looks like one of these more mobile options if it goes well. He's not going to be Jalen Hurts or Kyler Murray or anything like that, but he'll probably be a notch below those guys.
Yeah, and that's kind of where I'm at with it as well. Cameron Ward has more of those special traits that you're looking for, that playmaking ability. And although Shedeur may think he's a playmaker at times, which we'll touch upon once we get to Shedeur, he just doesn't have the traits that Cam Ward does. Cam Ward, superior arm in all aspects. I mean, the velocity that he can generate on the move is night and day compared to what we see from Shedeur Sanders. And the overall playmaking ability, being able to extend out of the pocket, being able to create plays. I mean, there was that one throw specifically against Florida, and then I sent you actually that clip, Corey, funny enough. And then the next game I watched against Louisville, and he makes almost the exact same throw. He's rolling out to his left, off foot, delivers that into the back corner of the end zone. And I'm sorry, Shedeur, he's just not making those type of plays. He can't develop that type of arm velocity on it.
Well, moving over to the receivers here, I'm interested to see that you actually have Egbuka a tier ahead of Burden, despite on the prospects page, Burden actually being higher.
I don't.
Yeah. So 2 things. For starters, I had to tweak the prospects page a little bit since I uploaded the first edition to it, because Egbuka didn't have his analytics bonuses kicking in. And one of the analytics bonuses is who you played with in college. And I can't think of two better receiver prospects than Jeremiah Smith and Marvin Harrison Jr. to play against and play alongside in college, in addition to Jackson Smith and Jigba, and as a freshman, actually Garrett Wilson and Chris Olave. There has never been a receiver with more competition for targets in his college career than Emeka Egbuka, yet his analytical profile is very strong still. That says a lot about how good of a player he is. Luther Burden is a great player. He has a ton of upside. I think at 100th percentile for both of these guys, he's probably the better NFL receiver. The problem is Luther Burden's profile and translatability is very scheme specific. He's going to need a creative offensive mind. He's going to need probably some time to develop a full route tree in the NFL, whereas you could drop Emeka Egbuka today in an NFL offense, ask him to operate at least as the number 2 receiver to start, and he'll give you very solid PPR production. And I do think he has the upside to become a number 1 receiver for an NFL team and the athleticism to kind of show that at the combine too.
The big difference for us is, so I have Burden as my 4th overall player, Egbuka as my 5. You have Egbuka as your 4th overall player, Burden as your 8. So the main difference is a couple of the running backs we haven't touched upon, specifically the Ohio State guys we'll touch upon in a second. You do have rated higher than Burden. I think you nailed it. They ended up with the exact same grade for me, 86.5. The reason why I do slightly prefer Burden on the tiebreaker is I do think that upper echelon upside is with Burden. And again, maybe it's more of a philosophical thing. Again, I love Egbuka. I think he's going to be a top 12, top 15 overall Garrett Wilson type of dynasty asset. For me, though, the upside that I saw from Burden going into this final season, obviously now he didn't take that step that we would have expected, but the vibes that I got after that second year where he had 1,300 yards, where he was a finalist for the Biletnikoff, is this guy is on the Jamar Chase, this guy's on the Malik Neighbors level trajectory, where he moves completely differently. If he can refine some of those aspects to his game, he can be valued as a top 5 overall pick. Now, he didn't take that quite step. I do think there was a lot of issues with the Missouri offense this past year, but that same type of player, the way he moves, the way he can snap, he's not quite a refined route runner at this point, but the way he moves, the way he attacks his breaks, you can see that being an upside if he's drafted in the right situation.
Awesome. Well, let's move over to the first Ohio State running back that we have here with Judkins. To my understanding, it's not close to being consensus, right? To have Judkins ahead of Henderson. I think most people have it flipped.
Yeah, I go back and forth on these two a lot because I think...
Same grade for me.
Yeah, I think part of the reason why Henderson consensus-wise is the preference is because if you look at the strengths and weaknesses of both players, what Henderson does results in more fantasy production, specifically because he's a better receiver than Quinshon Judkins. And I firmly do believe this about TreVeyon Henderson. He probably has the upside to one day be a 100-plus target running back. I think he has that type of capability if he can develop in the NFL. However, the reason I prefer Judkins is because I think Judkins has as high of a floor of a running back as any in this class. And I also think his ceiling, and this is going to sound hyperbolic for a guy who's finished as an RB1 5, 6, 7 times in his career, there were flashes of young Le'Veon Bell to Quinshon Judkins, in my opinion. The way he attacks the hole, he's like the vision he has, the patience, the anticipation that holes are going to open up for him, the profile that he has. We have 3-year sample size that this guy was one of the best college football running backs, just bar none, period. If you had to rank the college football running backs, Quinshon Judkins would have ranked very high for 3 straight years. And that says a lot about what his projection is into the NFL. People are going to have a little bit of questions about the athleticism, translatability on third down. I think that stuff is he can develop that stuff. And what he was asked to do specifically at Ohio State was move the chains, do the dirty work. TreVeyon got the outside zone kind of runs and the targets,
valuable
and stuff.
Touches.
Yeah, whereas Judkins had to do the dirty work. And because he played at Ole Miss also, and you saw him get both types of work, you saw him get the good stuff at Ole Miss and then the dirty work at Ohio State, makes him a universal scheme fit in my mind. I think you could drop him into any NFL offense and he could be their starting running back.
Yeah, and the main difference for me, Corey's a little bit more optimistic on the receiving ceiling. I still think he's got a ways to go to be a functional, true third down piece, which kind of reminds me of the development that we saw from Joe Mixon in the NFL, where he started off more of a 2-down banger, 30 to 50 target guy, but as we've seen, as he's developed in his career, has developed more of a receiving workload. Specifically, I mean, for example, we saw this year in Houston, when he was healthy, he was a legitimate receiving threat. So Joe Mixon, you get the physicality, you get the between the tackles ability, very smart runner, very decisive downhill runner. And I do think if you're a team within the top 40, top 50 of the NFL draft, he's your prototype NFL workhorse running back.
So I see whenever I averaged out y'all's rankings that you actually have Caleb Johnson right in between, like kind of as this group of 3 running backs here with Judson, Caleb, Henderson. Would the NFL Combine have any effect on how you're ranking these 3? Like, how extreme do the outcomes need to be at the Combine for you to flip this order?
It'd be tough because I don't really see them, any of these 3 guys, based on their expectations of what I have from them at the Combine, really being big outliers. Like, we expect Trevion Henderson to shred the Combine. Yeah, sure. Could it be a concerning thing if we expect Quinshon Judkins to be a 4.45 to 4.48 guy and he runs a 4.64? Absolutely. But based off what we can expect, what we saw these guys on film, like even Caleb Johnson, he can only go up after the Combine. We literally have him expected as a 4.56 type of guy. If he shocks and he ran a 4.49, maybe that's a scenario, but he's already my RB3 to begin with. So it's not even like I can raise him.
Yeah. The difference is that Danny has Caleb at 3. Yep. I have Judkins at 2 because I have him ahead of Hampton. And then I have Henderson at 4. So we're kind of just like, this is a tier of running backs very clearly because we differ on what we're valuing in each of these guys. I have factored in, like Danny kind of said, that Henderson's going to test better than both of them. Like that's part of his grade. That's when I watched him on film. I don't need the Combine to tell me that Henderson's a better athlete than Judkins is, at least from a speed standpoint. I don't need.
You don't get 10 out of 10 otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. It would show up in his grade if I thought he had athletic question marks. But like kind of Danny made reference to, if Judkins tests terribly and Henderson tests how I think he's going to test, then that would probably factor into the grades.
Yeah, and we talked about it in the frame of Judkins over Henderson, but they do actually have the same grade for me. So I will make the case for Henderson. Like Corey kind of alluded to, if both these guys hit at the next level, you can make the case that Henderson is the more valuable fantasy football asset based off the skill set that he has is most valuable to fantasy football production. The receiving ability that he has, the breakaway ability that he has, a guy that we're expecting to run in that 4.35 type of area at the Combine at what's listed as his 208 pounds. Now, we'll see if he actually ends up weighing in at 208. It could be more of like he's a 201 pound, 202 pound situation, but he is your type of running back where you can give him 12 to 14 touches in the game and he can have 1 or 2 of those touches explode for a 70-yard touchdown.
Well, yeah, the ceiling comp that people will have will be Jahmyr Gibbs, I would imagine, for Trevion Henderson. And to me, the ceiling for Judkins is higher from a workload standpoint. Like he can be a Le'Veon Bell or a Joe Mixon or a Leonard Fournette or an Ezekiel Elliott, somebody that you give like 350 touches to in one season.
And sorry, before we move on, we do kind of have to touch upon what makes Caleb Johnson such an extremely polarizing prospect, because on one hand, people might be looking at him saying, well, he doesn't really move the best and he's only 1 year of production at Iowa. But I would argue, despite only being a 1-year starter this past year, and people might point to, well, he had a workload in 2022. This year, he was the unquestioned workhorse at Iowa. Man, how developed he is as a runner really caught my eye. The intangibles that he has, the vision, the patience, a guy that's a day one starter in a zone blocking scheme. And it's funny because we talk about team fits in our own channel. And the one that I keep looking at is, man, if he was the Cowboys option in round 2, Clayton Adams coming over from Arizona. We saw obviously the success of the Arizona offensive line this past year with James Conner running behind it. My comp for him is literally James Conner, a no-nonsense runner, between the tackles guy that is going to be able to absorb contact. And we do have, from a metric standpoint, 4.42 yards after contact per attempt, 29.8 missed tackles forced per attempt, 23 rushing touchdowns in 2024. He can contribute inside the 10, inside the 5 in those short yardage situations. The only thing at this point is he's not as proven as a receiving back similar to Judkins, but like Corey thinks Judkins can take that next step at the next level. I think that in terms of Caleb Johnson, like we saw with James Conner this year.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to all 4 of these guys is that they're all RB1 upside prospects in the prospect model, which is a 62% hit rate for 15 plus point per game season in the NFL. And they peak as RB1s in Dynasty on the open market 75% of the time. So for these guys to be RB2 through 5, they would have been all by a country mile RB1 last year.
Clearly.
Well, let's move on to Matthew Golden. I know this is the perfect guy to look at when it comes to film versus analytics, because the profile's horrendous. You go and look at his FSE grade on the prospects page, and this dude is just littered next to a bunch of bust. If I actually look at receivers that were drafted inside the first 2 rounds to have 0.09 career first downs per route run, I mean, this entire list the only hits out of 42 names here, DK Metcalf, Juju, I'm not throwing Christian Kirk on there. I'm sorry, that's not happening. Maybe make an argument. Brandon Ayuk, DJ Moore, Brian Thompson. You got like 5 names, and Matthew Golden wasn't necessarily a high target earner either, which that's my main concern, right? Because you can make the argument, oh, Quinn Ewers is just a complete bum. He's not accurate. But he wasn't even thrown in the direction of Golden. So why, how good is the film for him to be ranked this high?
Well, I'll add one piece of context and I'll let you go because I'm sure you're going to touch upon it in a second. There's about 3 to 5 wide open dig routes that Quinn Ewers completely missed him on every game. Like that's pretty much a summary of why he wasn't more productive.
Yeah. Here's the thing with Golden. The names that you just listed, by the way, were also not good analytical prospects. Brandon Ayuk, DK Metcalf, those guys.
Yep.
His best comparable prospect in the prospect model is Ladd McConkey. And the reason that I think he is a lot like Ladd McConkey is because the NFL draft community, mainly, has decided that he's worthy of being a first-round receiver. And I see it. I see it on film. He is an exceptional route runner. He has very, very strong hands. He makes spectacular catches all the time. He's a technician. He worked downfield. He needs to get a little bit stronger. And, physicality and stuff could disrupt him. And obviously the production profile was an issue for him in college. But you have to contextualize that he didn't start for Texas for like 6 to 8 games once he transferred. He was injured his final year at Houston, so his production was down. When it mattered at Texas, he was the dude. It was very clear with the Arizona State game, the Georgia games, those important games down the stretch. He was the guy. So for me, you can look at his analytical profile on a basic context. Oh, what was his highest target share? Not good. Like it's very clear. He misses the mark on everything, like PPR points per game, first downs per route run, target share, targets per route run, yards per route run. He misses the mark on everything pretty much. But the film is really good. And when the film is really good, the NFL draft community is going to get him good draft capital, and draft capital equals opportunity. And the context that you can apply to his film when you watch the latter half of the Texas season is this guy showed you something. And that was very much the case with McConkey as well. When he was healthy and on the field, he was excellent. And I know his yards per route run and stuff was higher than Golden's, but he also played with a significantly better quarterback.
The way I best describe it, now obviously Stephon Diggs, the competitive nature, the dog factor that he has at the catch point, Golden's going to need to improve at the catch point straight up. His drops this year were an issue, but that flair, that movement ability, the way he snaps out of his breaks, man, it's hard not to see Stephon Diggs when I watch Matthew Golden. And I understand. I was actually with you, Mason. I'm like, how can this guy be such a good wide receiver prospect given the lack of production he's had in his career? But I'm telling you, once you turn on that tape and you see the way this guy attacks his routes, the way this guy is a 3-level separator, the way this guy is such an easy transition into being a top 2 target at the NFL level based on whoever drafts him. I'm talking Houston drafts him, the Cowboys draft him, the Steelers draft him. Any of those teams draft him. He is a ready-made number 2 wide receiver that if he develops in terms of the physicality department to his game, has number 1 level upside.
Yeah. I mean, just going back to it, the per route statistics scare me a ton because that was the difference between Ladd and him is that Ladd never had great like total numbers, but when he was on the field, he was doing something. And
it's tough because McConkey was a short area target. Golden was not. And McConkey had Beck, who played like a top 10-5 quarterback in college football his final year at Georgia. And Quinn Ewers, you and I both
Anybody
know.
That tries to tell him he's good is faded. They've not
Quinn
watched
Ewers sucks. Like he's a horrible quarterback, especially downfield where Golden operated.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, we'll see. It's just so reminiscent of the Adonai Mitchell thing. And I'm going to agree that I think Quinn Ewers, in comparison to what expectations were versus what reality was, I mean, he was on the cover of the NCAA game, like expectations.
So was Donovan Edwards.
Expectations versus reality could not have been farther apart. But I mean, I think there are a lot of other wide receivers we're going to be talking about today that their quarterbacks were even worse than Quinn Ewers.
I disagree personally.
Yeah,
given the role.
Yeah.
The fact if he was a short area target and he couldn't command targets, that's your own fault. But you got to get downfield targets from this dude, and he can't throw the ball.
I saw way too many times he's running a wide open dig down the middle of the field, and Quinn's not even getting there in his progression. Like that's as simple as it is. The guy was getting open, he just wasn't getting the ball. Like I know you could make the case about X amount of prospects per year that applies to. It's it's bothering how consistent he was at creating separation and Quinn not even getting there. Like, I don't know how else to say it.
Well, let's move over to somebody that I don't even know like what context we can talk about him. I mean, with Travis Hunter, if he was a full-time wide receiver, he would be, I'm assuming, in the same tier as Ginty and between Ginty and Tet, or
he'd be 3 for me and probably
he'd be wide receiver 1 for me.
Okay.
Yeah, he'd be 2 for Danny, 3 for me.
Okay. But beyond that, like the main question I have is, say he tests as a corner. At every step of the process, he's a corner. And even on NFL draft night, they tell us, hey, the team that drafted him, he's going to primarily be playing cornerback. At that point, which looks to be probably the most likely outcome, is he worth like an early 3rd round rookie pick?
Yeah,
absolutely.
If he's going to be a sub-package wide receiver in the NFL, like that's what we're hearing, like he's going to moonlight on offense or something like that, I do think I would still spend a mid-second rounder on him. But if we get anywhere close to 50% of the team's routes, I would still be willing to spend an early to maybe even a late first on him.
He's the most polarizing guy in my opinion, because like we were talking about, if we got the news tomorrow, the team that drafted him said, Travis Hunter, wide receiver, Colorado, and we got reports, hey, he's going to play wide receiver even 80% of the time, he'd be a top 2 player in this class for me. What I saw on film from Travis Hunter, the high end legitimately looks like Odell Beckham Jr., and I'm not even exaggerating.
Well, yeah, I just have no idea what to do with him. And I almost don't even think like we can talk about him too much, to be honest. I will say, based off like what I'm seeing with NFL mock drafts, if Sanders is a top 5 pick, I'm easily taking him up there, at least by like the 107, 108.
And I will trade down to people like you, because we're not good at this. We're not good at evaluating quarterbacks, the dynasty community. I get it. I'm still going to try. And for my money, here's what Shedeur Sanders does better than Cam Ward, because we spent a lot of time talking about what Cam Ward does well. Shedeur is more accurate than Cam Ward. He can throw a better deep ball than Cam Ward. And I think he sees the field better than Cam Ward. But his absolute ceiling is Tua Tagovailoa, who is like the quarterback 21 in Dynasty right now, and a 7th round startup pick. So would Shedeur, if he had a good rookie season, would people kind of push him up to like QB 13 or 14 or something like that in Dynasty rankings? And that 109 that you spent on him is probably a productive, maybe even an asset that's worth close to 2 first-round picks on the open market? Absolutely. I just personally think there's enough really good quarterbacks in Dynasty out there right now that I'm just going to sell that quarterback asset to my league mates and trade down and take Caleb Johnson instead, or trade down and take Travion Henderson or Golden or whoever else instead. I'm just not going to use, if I have a quarterback needy team, that 107 or whatever on Shedeur Sanders. I'll trade for a quarterback in that big cluster of Dak Prescott, Bryce Young, Michael Penix, Trevor Lawrence, Jared Goff, Tua Tagovailoa, JJ McCarthy. There's a million guys in there I would rather have than Sanders, because I think he is extremely risky. And what Danny's probably about to say is because he thinks he has much better tools than he is. And when you have tools like Caleb Williams had tools, and you still get humbled by how fast the NFL game is, that scares the crap out of me.
See, the thing with Shedeur Sanders is when he's clean, he gets through his progressions, he delivers an accurate football. I have no problem with his game. When he is under pressure, the guy just forgets what he's doing. That's the best way I can describe it. When he faces an ounce of pressure, and there's opportunities where he can step up in the pocket, evade a free rusher, deliver the ball down the field, it's almost like his mental processing just resets the moment he sees pressure, and he thinks he has tools, like Corey said, like a Caleb Williams, like a Drake May, where he could roll out to his left and deliver cross body. And sure, sometimes it'll work when there's enough separation down the field, but other times when you have to deliver into tight windows like it will be in the next level, he just doesn't generate enough velocity on the football to get away with that.
Yeah, I will say, like, and I'm not going to sit here and pretend like I know what I'm doing scouting quarterbacks. Obviously, I don't. Yep. But it is always, like, funny and concerning to me. Like, if you just go on Twitter and you see some random NFL account hyping up a prospect, where they go, oh, look at Sanders spin out of the pocket, run around like a chicken with his head cut off for 15 seconds, and then find someone.
How translatable is it?
I'm like, yeah, how does this translate at all to NFL play?
And I think that's the biggest issue with Sanders right now is he's got the tools to get away with it at the college level. Is that going to work at the NFL level? That's where I have my reservations. The best way I can describe it is last year, Yes, I understand the context, better quarterback class, but I'll also counter the running back strength this year is going to push more running backs in the first round. We were getting Bo Nix at the 202 last year, the 203 last year, and I had a higher grade on Nix than I do have on Shedeur this year.
Much higher for me.
Much
I
higher.
had really high grade on Knicks last year.
But and like obviously you can point, well, look at how that's aged. Nix obviously is developed, but Nix landed in a situation with Sean Payne in an offense that fit him like a glove.
And
that's still a projection.
He had a better arm and could run better too. That was the other thing.
Yeah.
Well, let's move over to the tight end position. And I'm assuming that we're all in agreement that Tyler Warren would be tight end 1 for the NFL. It's just that
the NFL.
We're talking fantasy here, and that's why he's not your tight end 1.
I even think from an NFL draft perspective, I actually just prefer Loveland. Obviously, once you contextualize the fantasy fit, I think he fits a lot more offenses than Warren does. I think what you're referring to, right, is the NFL draft media perspective. You're going to see people mocking Warren in the top 10, Loveland more so as a top 20 guy. I actually prefer Loveland's tape straight up.
Yeah, like from a fantasy perspective, Loveland is the prototype. Like if you go to my top 12 dynasty tight ends, their average size 6'4", 245. Loveland is 6'5", 245. Their average relative athletic score is 8.5. So when we're talking Bowers, McBride, Laporta, all those guys, you got to be a good athlete to play this position at a high level and be a featured weapon in your passing game. It's very hard for a guy who's like an average athlete, which Warren might be. We'll see what happens at the combine, to become the number 1 or the number 2 in their NFL offense. And Loveland is like a big receiver out there. He looks like Trey McBride at times. He looks like my comp for him was Tucker Kraft, who Tucker Kraft tested very well at the combine and outright beat a higher draft capital tight end in his own tight end core with Luke Musgrave there. So I think Loveland is an interesting player in the right offense with, Sean Payton in Denver or something, or the Rams or the Chargers or something like that. He could end up being a really big part of their passing game. And I think because he's 2.5 years younger than Tyler Warren too, I feel really confident that he can develop more of a skill set to his game, because he had some issues, drops and blocking technique and things of that nature. But like, he's barely 21 years old on draft. Like, he can barely drink legally when he gets drafted. Like, he's very young still.
To describe this discrepancy between them, think of Colson Loveland as your more natural fluid separator. Tyler Warren, more of the guy like, I'm going to throw it in anywhere in his vicinity, and he's just got the strong hands, the verticality to be able to come down with it.
Awesome. Yeah.
Like the throwback tight end.
Yeah. And I will double down on what like Corey said about the NFL combine doesn't matter for a lot of things, but for the tight end position, like based off what I did, I like wrote like a big dynasty research book a few years ago and like did in-depth research like with the combine importance. Wide receiver just doesn't freaking matter, but tight end, it's almost everything. Like it's easier to evaluate these guys based off their combine than it is almost their production numbers, which is hilarious.
Yeah, well, and Loveland's production is also very much needed context that the Michigan offense threw the ball for like 1,800 yards this year, and he had like almost 650 himself. Like it's a huge market share for a terrible offense.
I believe there was a stat out of 129 qualified FBS offenses, the Michigan passing offense was 123rd. I believe that was the stat this year. Yeah. I mean, you have Davis Warren, you have Jack Tuttle. I mean, right when Corey watched the game that Jack Tuttle started, he's like, I don't know who the hell this guy is, but he is like, how is he even playing?
I said, fire all these quarterbacks into the sun was the text that I sent you.
Yeah. Well, it's horrible.
Let's move over to a running back that just almost took out our Texas Longhorns, Corey. I mean, it was one hell of a performance.
Tone setter.
Yeah. Scattaboo's fun, man. Every frat bro loves some Cam Scattaboo, but in all seriousness, it's going to sound hyperbolic to say this, but his prospect profile in the FSC models, best comparable prospect is Alvin Kamara. And the reason for it is because he has exceptional receiving numbers. Like his yards per route run, his target share is year 1 to 3, receiving yards, market share, all those like analytical measures for Cam Scattaboo, in addition to like yards after catchability and, all the stuff that matters to be a good receiver. Like literally any metric you could measure a receiving back at the college level, he crushes. Like he's like one of the best in this entire class. He was excellent on the goal line. He's got good size. The question for him is, how athletic is he? That's really all that people are thinking probably right now. And, of course, for all these running backs, we need good draft capital as well. But I think if he tests decent, he's going to go in the 2nd or the 3rd round of the NFL draft. And I think people are going to really underrate how much of a receiving ceiling this dude actually has.
Yeah, and on the player card, I actually wrote down, I said, jack of all trades, but master of none. Because I
disagree. You wrote that and I erased it because I don't think it's true.
See, okay, from a receiving perspective, I would agree. From a pure rushing standpoint, from an elusiveness standpoint, from a speed standpoint, he's not a master of all of them. I'll agree with you in the aspect that from a receiving perspective, he can get there because of the efficiency numbers he posted from the targets that he commanded. But it just in terms of being an every down back, think of like a Kyron Williams with a little bit more receiving upside. And obviously in fantasy, we love that, but does he get the opportunity to function as a main RB1? Like we saw with Kyron Williams, because I think Kyron Williams kind of landed in the perfect spot to be able to do so.
And I know that this FSC grade on the prospect model is going to change a bunch when we get combine numbers and NFL draft capital. But I was watching, I think, the video you put out on Fantasy Stock Exchange, Corey, of like breaking this down and how high he is in this model. But his 10 closest players in terms of the score, not his comps, but the FSC grade: Brees, Najee, Gibbs, Javonte, Hampton, then Chubb, Kamara, Walker, Dalvin, and Rashad Penny. Like that's insane in comparison to like the depth at running back over the past 3 or 4 years that we've had.
The only thing that you can say, okay, why the heck does he rank that high? The only thing that you could say as a detractor is in the FSC model, there is a qualifier if you're a Power 5 running back or if you're not a Power 5 running back. He kind of cheats the system a little bit because he played at Sacramento the first 2 years of his career and then transferred to Arizona State for the final 2 years. So he gets the marker of being a Power 5 running back, but some of his career numbers include when he was not a Power 5 running back. But most of the important stuff is mainly Power 5 numbers. It's just he does cheat the system a little bit because he did transfer to a Power 5 school and had some really, really insane production at Sacramento.
And I will add on quickly as well, because you didn't really touch upon that, Corey. The only issue that I might have with his third down translatability is the guy's an awful pass blocker. That's the thing that I have a problem with. If you're going to see a 4.63, 4.64 type of runner, yes, he's a really good in terms of receiving situations. Is he going to get those third down snaps if they know that he's not bringing that breakaway ability and he struggles as a pass blocker is my issue.
Yeah.
Well, let's move over to a running back that's a lot lower with his FSC grade, with Dylan Sampson.
Yeah, Sampson's got a really intriguing skill set. Danny loves him. His best comparable guy in the model is actually Devon Achane, which is a top 5 dynasty running back right now. He's got a really intriguing couple of traits. He's extremely fast. He's really, really elusive, and he can be an exceptional receiver if he develops at the next level. He is 5'11", 201 pounds listed from the University of Tennessee. We'll see what he actually weighs in at. But he's going to run in the probably low 4.3s, if not high 4.2s. Yeah. Like he's got that type of speed, and he's probably never going to command 250 to 300 carries, 300 touches in a season. But I would have said that about Achane coming out, and Achane just had a monster workload. So you never know with these guys. But the historical precedent is usually bigger running backs get those type of workloads.
Yeah, and comparatively to Corey, the main difference in our grade, you were at an 80.5, I was at an 83.0, as I was higher on the intangible traits of Sampson. Obviously, people are going to point to the tangibles, the size, the speed. He's, like Corey said, probably going to be somewhere between like the 4.28 to 4.34 range, I would guess, in terms of his combine 40-yard dash. But I did see a guy that, despite being a first-year runner, man, he understood how to play the position. He knew when he needed to cut it back. He knew when he needed to tempo his runs on outside zone plays. I thought he was a lot more of a finished product intangibly than maybe you would expect from a guy that was his first year of production on the scene. And I mean, maybe part of it, obviously Tennessee, very running back friendly scheme could have helped him in that regard. But I also just think when it came down to it, picking the right gaps, being able to put his foot in the ground, get vertical, use that 4.3 type of speed, Dylan Sampson was making every correct decision that I saw on tape.
Yeah, no, can't drink legally until after week 3 of
20.6.
By the way, week 3 of his rookie season is when he can have his first legal drink. He is really young too.
Awesome. Well, let's run through a couple more of these guys because I know this is a little bit of a bigger tier.
Yeah, I want to. Should I throw Tootin into this because he's exactly the same type of player?
Go for it.
Yeah. Go ahead. Yeah. I haven't gotten to Tootin yet, but obviously we'll address that.
So Tootin, I actually have like a few spots higher than Sampson because he kind of does the exact same thing Sampson does, only he has maybe Chris Johnson speed. Like he is that fast. 0 to 10 yards. He is one of the fastest running backs I've seen on college tape before. And his elusiveness marks are the best in this class, bar none. Like he broke the most tackles, third most tackles in this class at 5'8 3/4", 211 pounds. So he actually has the size, unlike Sampson. And he made the most people miss in space. And he's like, you get you can't get a hand on this guy. Like, he's like an absolute jukebox. Like, it's impossible to tackle this dude. So for me, I look at him and I'm like, he's basically the same exact type of running back as Samson with 10 more pounds and more solidified production over a couple of years as well, because Samson was a 1-year starter for Tennessee. So Tootin is a guy that is not actually in the first edition of the draft guide. He will be in the second edition of the draft guide, but he is the first running back I was so excited to watch him right after the draft guide launched, because he is the only running back not in the first edition of the draft guide that was in the RB2 upside tier or better. So he's in the same tier, according to the model, as like Ollie Gordon and Dylan Sampson and a couple of the other guys there. So he's got a great profile, to be honest.
Awesome. Well, let's move over to Higgins real quick. What is funny, and I know this is just completely off and doesn't help anybody at all, but we have like a lot of these players with the same last name as like current NFL guys. So like, I had to look up like, oh, is Higgins related to T. Higgins? Oh, is McMillan related to Jalen McMillan? But I
Ollie Gordon related to Melvin Gordon.
Yeah.
Jaden Higgins, Danny, you want to take it away on him?
Yeah, I mean, we could address it. So he is currently, I believe, my wide receiver 8 and your wide receiver 6. Is that correct, Corey?
Yeah, that's correct.
Yeah, so Jaden Higgins, your prototype big X developmental wide receiver, 6'4", 217-pound listed size, 22 years old. Obviously, the big standout marks for him in our grading cycle: elite hands, anything around the vicinity, he's going to be plucking into his frame. And a guy that you would see the size, you would see the X roll, and you would think, okay, maybe he's more of an underdeveloped route runner. But I really did see a lot more nuance to his route running, to his overall technique than I expected going into his film. With Jaden Higgins, a guy that I'm expecting to go in that top 40, top 50 range of the NFL draft. Your comp for him was a guy like Courtland Sutton, who we've seen have plenty of success this year, more of a refined number 1 wide receiver. We've also seen the touchdown upside from Sutton in the past. For me, it's more of a combo. He's got like that power forward slasher appeal that we saw from Jawan Jennings this year, but I also think his route running technique is more so reminiscent of a guy like Michael Pittman Jr. So my comp would somewhere be between those 2 wide receivers.
Yeah, he's an interesting prospect. And I know, Mason, you talked about him in relation to like his production profile and how him and Jalen Noel, like, are we going to really throw them in the stratosphere of like some of these great wide receiver duos that we've seen in college football? I will say, like, they were extremely dominant of this offense. Jalen Noel and Jaden Higgins, they were pretty much the whole offense from a production standpoint, with Higgins being more of the downfield, no Mickey Mouse targets type of guy, where he was working as the X receiver, earning every single blade of grass. Whereas Noel was more, slot receiver, kind of integrated as like more of a design touches guy. So that's why his profile and Higgins' profile look a little bit more similar than maybe they actually are when it comes to translatability to the NFL. But yeah, Higgins to me is the type of guy that is not ready to be the number 1 of his team yet. But if you dropped him onto a team in like a year or 2 years from now, he could develop into a number 1, kind of like the way Michael Pittman did with the Indianapolis Colts. I think that would make sense.
Awesome. Well, with Ollie Gordon, how much of like these running backs down here near the bottom of these rankings is just going to come down to landing spot, draft capital, NFL combine, like information that we don't already have?
So I will say more than last year, it will be less important, because I actually just think this tier of running backs, like we'll talk Gordon, Devin Neal, Damian Martinez, like, I mean, even Tootin and Sampson, like we already talked about. Yeah, like it's important that they get good draft capital and good landing spots, like it always is for running backs. But these prospects are not the type of running backs that we normally see go into the like 3rd and 4th round of the NFL draft. Like the guys last year, like the Blake Corums and the Marshawn Lloyds and stuff, like they're worse prospects than these guys. And it's possible that just by the sheer depth of this class at running back, that Ollie Gordon suffers and Devin Neal suffers, and some of these other guys that would have gone probably RB2 to 5 off the board last year. So with Gordon, it's like he has, in theory, everything you would want for him to be a stud NFL starting running back. 6'1", 233, huge size, great receiving production. Doak Walker Award winner as a sophomore. Last year, like the wheels fell off for him. He looked slow. Yeah. He looked unmotivated at times. Like there's some questions maybe about his character. He had an open bottle of tequila and vodka in a vehicle while he was driving. Like we don't know what to think of Ollie Gordon at this point in time. All we know is that if he can recapture 2023 Ollie Gordon, he might end up being one of the best backs in this class.
Yeah, and the thing with Ollie Gordon, obviously people are going to have question marks on the athleticism. People are going to have question marks in the elusiveness, especially this year. He just didn't really make a lot of people miss. I will also point to the fact that the Oklahoma State offensive line this year was just night and day worse than what it was in 2023. Multiple times I was watching Oklahoma State, and there's just simply no push up front. I mean, I don't remember his name, but their right guard, I swear, every single second right after the snap, the guy's getting swim moved in the backfield. And it's like, what are we doing here? If Ollie Gordon doesn't have a runway, Ollie Gordon isn't the type of back like a Bishal Tuden, like you mentioned, to just make somebody miss and gain an extra 5 yards. He's the type of runway runner where if you get him behind a good offensive line the next level and he can get going, he's the type of guy that can keep going throughout a game. Think of a Najee Harris, for example, and I think his best fit would actually be with the Pittsburgh Steelers to replace Najee.
I will make a very hyperbolic comparison for 1 second here, because his best plays his sophomore year, the way he runs kind of upright and like head of steam freight train, he looks like Derrick Henry at times. Like he has that type of size and that type of physicality, and he runs like that with like the long strides and stuff. He's obviously not as good as Derrick Henry is, but there's a chance that like if he can capture his best moments and land in a system like what Derrick Henry had with Tennessee, where it was like gap scheme, get a hole and just fucking house it 90 yards or whatever. That's what Gordon needs at the next level. He needs an offense that can blow holes wide open for him.
Yeah, agreed.
Let's move over to another wide receiver that you're probably going to have to sell me on the tape for, because the numbers don't look great.
Yeah, this is another one of these guys that it's pretty hard to defend the profile. Elikai Manor from Stanford. The only thing I can say to defend the profile is this. Nothing cheap in his profile.
No,
like literally every single catch he got was like man coverage, press coverage, 10 yards, 15 yards downfield, having to fight off a defender because the throw was late getting to him. Like there's no screen targets. He had 4 screen targets his entire career. Like he's not getting any kind of like manufactured work. And what he did also, I don't think was his correct role. He played as receiver at Stanford, and I think he should be a big slot in the NFL. Think of the way that Juju Smith-Schuster was used in Pittsburgh, the way that Chris Godwin gets used in Tampa Bay, the way that Christian Kirk was used when he got to Jacksonville. Jalen Coker is my comp for him, because I think Jalen Coker and him kind of reminded me just play style wise of each other. So Io Manor is an interesting player for sure. His profile isn't good though. Like there's no way to sugarcoat it. I will say though, he's kind of the Colston Loveland of wide receivers, where the Stanford offense threw for like 2,400 yards this year, and he had 900 of those. Like he did have good market share numbers. He just didn't have good, he never had 1,000 yards, for example.
Yeah. And I think Corey pretty much highlighted it. The compete level off the charts, 7.5 out of 7.5 on the toughness scale for both of us. And we do think that the role he was being used in terms of college, not really necessarily fitting his best traits. I also, for what it's worth, people aren't going to talk about how refined of a route runner he is at 6'2", 210. I thought he was a very good route runner on tape. Like you said, running those big boy routes, running those nuanced routes. He wasn't really a guy that was put in space on a drag route, go create for yourself, make people miss. You didn't really see that usage at Stanford, but like Corey alluded to, I think his best role at the next level is as a power slot, because I think there's just so much left in terms of meat on the bone for him to increase his overall yak per reception, because at Stanford, he just wasn't afforded the opportunity to.
Well, awesome. Well, we got one tier left to go through these top 24.
Yeah. I'll rattle 2 of these, Danny, and then you can rattle the other 2. I'll go with Neal and Martinez, because I just love these guys.
Those are your guys.
I think they're just, again, what I said about Gordon is the same for these guys. I think they're going to probably go in the 3rd, 4th round of the NFL draft. And by historical hit rates and blah, 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 we should probably downgrade them for that kind of draft capital versus like going in the top 50 or whatever. But I think in a lot of other running back classes, Devin Neal would be getting a lot more pub than he's getting, because he had a very productive, he's literally the most productive running back in Kansas Jayhawks history. He's like been a workhorse for like 4 years in college, and he does everything at a super high level. He's a good receiver. He's a good, contact balance runner. He's very smart. He has good vision. He's good elusiveness. He just doesn't probably have an elite 6th gear of speed. And you don't need that at the running back position. Like, yeah, it's better when we have like 4.3 runners or whatever. But when you have the size, he weighed in officially already at the Senior Bowl. He's 5'10", 220. He's a dude. He kind of reminds me a little bit of like, I didn't actually officially comp him to Tyler Algier, but now that I'm like saying it, he kind of reminds me a little bit of Tyler Algier. And if Tyler Algier doesn't get nuked by Bijan Robinson getting drafted to that team, he probably would have been very productive the last couple of years for the Falcons as their starting ball carrier. And Javonte Williams was my other kind of comp that I gave him as well.
Yeah, my comp that I gave him, projected role, committee back plus. I think he can be the leader of a committee. I think that's the only thing is maybe because of potential athletic limitations. Not saying limitations, 4.53, 4.55, still going to be a fine runner. But typically speaking, from a trait standpoint, maybe you don't see a true refined, clear workhorse running back. But if you're telling me you can get a running back that can get 15 to 18 touches as a lead back in the committee, that's kind of what I envision for Devin Neal. I'd comp to a guy like Jay Ajayi, which if Jay Ajayi never had those degenerative knee issues, man, the guy, the way he moved, the way he made people miss at his size, that's what Devin Neal reminded me of. Because
Also
you would look
Javonte Williams for what it's worth.
you'll watch Devin Neal and you'll think, okay, this guy weighs 205 pounds. Like the way he moves, the ball carry moves that he has, you would not think that of a 220-pound running back. And I know when Jay Ajayi was in his prime, he kind of had that similar factor but this guy's making people miss in a phone booth at 225 pounds.
Yeah, that was kind of my question. It's funny that you bring up like Tyler Algier, because I was going to ask, like, is this kind of the Alexander Madison mold where it's like, hey, if there's an injury in his backfield, he's going to be a locked and loaded starter for your fantasy lineup. Whereas like the way that the NFL probably views him is kind of know what we're going to get, but we're not only going to be relying on him.
Yeah, I think with Neal, he is slightly above the caliber of those guys. Yeah. I think that an NFL team, if they hit on a 4th round pick on Devin Neal, would just ride him for 3 years. You know what I mean? Okay. Like, I don't actually envision them being like, we need to get a better running back than this. This isn't good enough kind of thing. Because I think Neal doesn't really give you any reason to believe that. I think there's a reason he's not going to get drafted super high. But once he's actually in an NFL offense, like, he's the type of guy that benefits from tape, not from the whole draft process of running drills and doing combine stuff. Like, the further we get away from the college football season, the worse and worse Devin Neal's going to look.
The way I describe it is for Devin Neal, I think he moves better and he wins with elusiveness better than this running back. But in terms of just standing of caliber starter, I can see maybe like a Brian Robinson type where he could be that 200 carry back. But you'll always have the question marks of, do they bring in an Austin Eckler or do they replace like a 3rd down back in this upcoming draft? That's kind of the questions I have, where with Washington, we know if Brian Robinson is scheduled to get the type of workload that he got last year, you're getting a consistent 200 carries.
Yeah, and he's like an 8th round redraft pick, and he ends up being one of the best values on the board because he was like RB19 or something in points per game. And then with Martinez, I'll quickly touch on him. He's pretty straightforward. He's just like Devin Neal, except he's probably not as good of a receiver as Devin Neal.
That's Edwards.
Little bit bigger. You have him comped to Gus Edwards. I have him comped to, like, I think he has kind of Kareem Hunt minus the receiving skill set upside, or Chris Carson if you want to focus on like a, prototypical 1st and 2nd down banger. Speaking of Chris Carson, I would love to see Damian Martinez in a Las Vegas Raiders uniform running for Pete Carroll and that team, because I think he would be a perfect fit for their offense. And he's one of these guys too that, like, similar to what I said with Judkins, he was just one of the best running backs in college football for 3 straight years. And he also can barely drink alcohol legally. So for him to start as a freshman at Oregon State, start as a sophomore at Oregon State, transfer to Miami, get a little bit more receiving work to his profile, and still be a starter, even though he never commanded like 300 touches in any given season, he was just consistently one of the most efficient running backs in the entire draft. He actually quote tweeted a tweet from PFF College the other day and was like, just turn on the tape. I've been good for 3 years. He literally tweeted that.
Yeah, and he's not wrong. Obviously, there's limitations in terms of the type of player that you're getting, but you just need a big physical between the tackles back that can contribute inside the 5, inside the 10-yard line. That's why I have my comp to Gus Edwards, where it's like, yeah, you think of Gus Edwards now and you think, oh, he's old, he's injured, he's inefficient, but there was a time in his prime Baltimore Ravens days where while he wasn't getting that 250 touch workload, he was averaging like 5.2 a pop on 180 carries a year.
Yeah. Dameon Pierce, another guy that you could maybe... Yeah. He has like a similar career trajectory. Ramondre Stevenson maybe as well, like where it's a big back who can contribute a little bit on 3rd down, but not a whole lot.
Well, let's look at 2 receivers that are neck and neck. And can you tell me if this yards per route run number for Trey Harris is real, or did you have a typo when you're putting this in?
No, it's 5.15. It is. However, it's not going to be 5.15 if he doesn't get injured when he gets injured, because he only played 9 games this year. And 4 or 5 of those games were against, me, Mason, and Danny in the secondary. Like, Furman or whatever, he had like 300 yards in that game. Like, so that's going to inflate his numbers a little bit. That being said, it's a 100th percentile mark. No receiver has ever posted in the prospect model a higher number than 5.15 yards per row run. So we got to give Trey Harris his flowers. He's the opposite of Alec Manor, and some of these other prospects where we're like, we got to Golden, where we got to contextualize the film to the numbers. It's his numbers are better than the film.
You got to contextualize the numbers for the
his
film.
number on those guys, we would have an exceptionally good prospect. But we don't have that with Trey Harris. He kind of reminded me of like Keon Coleman, where he looks like he's almost freestyling out there. He doesn't really know how to run routes properly. I don't think anybody ever taught him how to run a route. He kind of just is a good enough athlete, in a good conference, has a good quarterback, can, break vertical plays downfield, and he just got a lot of big plays out of it. And it's not to take anything away from him, because he has a decent profile and he actually has redeeming qualities. The athleticism is going to be the first checkpoint for him. If he's a great athlete, he can continue to do that at the next level as he develops. But I do tend to think the way all of us Dynasty players think, we're going to watch this guy have maybe a face planter rookie season. And what are we going to decide from that point on? Because he is going to take time to develop, and we are not a patient group.
Yeah.
We watched Quentin Johnson look like trash for his first year, and then he came out and actually looked like a decent NFL receiver his second season.
Side note, Quentin Johnson, probably the best value in underdog drafts and maybe Dynasty leagues at the moment.
Ooh, okay.
There you go. Okay. But that's what Trey Harris is. He's not going to be the type of guy that we look at and be like, oh yeah, week 1 of his rookie season, he's like the best waiver addition. I just don't see that happening. I think he's going to take a while to develop.
My comp, very similar. You had the Keon Coleman. Mine was actually Juju Smith-Schuster. And obviously, as we've seen with Juju Smith-Schuster, certain situations where you have one of the best X wide receivers of all time, you can produce 1,400 yards in your second year. But in terms of just playing the wide receiver position, not the most fluid athlete, isn't going to make you fucking miss, isn't really going to create a lot of separation, but in the right situation, he's got the toughness, he's got some physicality to his game. I think he can develop, especially from a yak standpoint, by the way, a really good yak wide receiver. And I think that's going to be the underlying factor here. You get a strong offensive mind that knows how to sculpt him, knows how to get the best out of him. I think he could be a very productive wide receiver. But there's definitely a lot of holes in this game to the point where he's going to walk into any situation. He's going to be this fundamental 1,000 plus yard receiver. I don't necessarily see that, but who knows? Maybe he gets drafted by the Rams in round 2 and maybe they're able to get the best out of him. I mean, nobody was saying that about Puka Nacua when he got drafted.
I definitely wasn't. That's for sure.
You definitely were not.
Jalen Royals, very, very fun. That's how I'll describe it with Jalen Royals. You're getting the yak ability. You're getting 10 out of 10 hands. I mean, the guy is physical at the catch point. The guy will catch anything in his vicinity. And you're getting elite production. Obviously, there is some skewed ability like Trey Harris, where he did get injured this year. So it's more of a per game type of thing. But you watch Jalen Royals, I think people are going to get the Deebo Samuel. People are going to get the Jaden Reed comps every single year. Jalen Royals is fouled with.
Yeah, I'm more Jaden Reed than Deebo Samuel for him. He's just Utah State wide receiver who can play on the outside and kind of run in any given way. The only problem is, I think his best projection at the NFL level is probably going to be a design touches slot receiver, most likely, if I had to guess. But we'll have to kind of wait and see what his athletic numbers look like.
Awesome.
Yep.
Well, I appreciate it. And do y'all have anything to plug? Anything to point people to? Obviously, we'll have the link to Fantasy Stock Exchange both in the comment section and the description of this at the very top. If you're not already following them, don't know what you're doing, but I'm sure you are. Do y'all have anything else to say?
Yeah, so first edition of the draft guide is out. Everything, pretty much every player except for Byshell Tootin that we talked about, were in the draft guide, and we have write-ups and all that kind of stuff. So if you're into the nitty-gritty kind of film takes or whatever, you can definitely check that out. March 15th is when we'll have the second edition of the draft guide out. So we'll have updated combine numbers, official heights and weights, probably about 20-ish plus more prospects that we add to the thing for about 50 to 55 before the NFL draft. And then also in the prospect model this year, we added in some of the prospect model comps. So if you scroll down all the way to the end of the draft guide, you can see the running back model, and it shows, where Ashton Genty's comps are. And it shows that he's right next to Ezekiel Elliott and Leonard Fournette, for example. And if he tests really well, he can be up kind of near Christian McCaffrey and Saquon Barkley kind of thing. And it goes through the entire class, whether their write-ups are in the draft guide or not. The entire class of running backs and wide receivers are included in the draft guide there. And of course, the prospects page, you can kind of tinker around with that stuff.
Yeah. Last thing, we actually did put out the rookie rankings on the site as well. So go to the rankings page. You can hit dynasty.superflex, Dynasty 1QB, or you can go hit a different format and you'll see the rookie rankings that are up there. But I think that's all we got. Thank you again for coming on, guys.